is Parshas B'Shalach, and the sugya we will be discussing today is a fascinating sugya, like all the others, interesting, like all the others, and relevant, like many others. So this week's Parsha we learn about Parshas Haman, and Moshe Rabbeinu speaks to the Klal Yisrael, Re'u ki Hashem nosen lechem es Shabbos, al ken nosen lechem b'yom shishi lechem yomayim. Shavu ishtachatov al yetze ish memekoymoi b'yoyim hashvi'i. And in Masechet Eruvin there are two different pshotim, two different interpretations. What does this posuk mean? Shavu ishtachatov al yetze ish memekoymoi. Daf Yud Zayin Amud Beis in Masechet Eruvin, the Gemara gives a pshat. This is the source for Maleches Hoitzah, that it is prohibited, Osa lahoitzi meshus leshus, meshus hayochid leshus harabim, or the other way around, meshus harabim lireshus hayochid. And then the Gemara says, no, the posuk doesn't say al yotzi ishmem koimoi, but rather al yetzei ishmem koimoi. Hoitzah meshus leshus is only if you carry an object, a thing. So the Fnun Aleph in Eruvin, the other pshat is Techumin. Al Yetze Ishmem Koimoi, one should not go out of Tchum Shabbos. And as we all know, Tchum Shabbos is Al Payim Amo. And it's a stira in the Rambam. Mitzvahs lo tase shinchof alav sefer mitzvahs, the Rambam clearly says, Al Yetze Ishmem Koimoi is alav, lo tase, it is one of the Tayyig mitzvahs. And what does it mean? One cannot go 2,000 ames out of the city, as long as he leaves a residential area and is out in the open plains, in the woods, he cannot walk more than Alpayim Amah. The Rambam Choseboy, he retracted, and in Perek Chav Zayin Alocha Aleph in Mishnah Torah, Hilchas Shabbos, the Rambam says Alpayim Amah is only in Issur Rabbanon. Techumin Diurai says Yud Beis Mil Gimel Parsa. We don't find the Shir of Yud Beis Mel anywhere in Bavli, but it is in Yerushalmi, Eruvin Chov Gimel Amud Beis. And the Rif in the Rambam Paskin, Yud Beis Mel Menatoyer Alpayim Amah is only Midrabanan. And many Rishonim maintain that the entire Issur of Techumin is only Midrabanan. Rashi on the spot in our posuk, the Ramban, both in Sefer HaMitzvahs and in Sof Perek Kama, the Eruvin in Sefer HaMalchamis, the Balamor agrees with the Ramban. Techumin is the Rabbanan. That is also the opinion of the Rosh. Eruvin Perek Aleph Simen Chav Daled Shalosh Machloikes V'Davar. There are three different sources in which we find the Issur of Tchum way before Chachmei Mishnah and Shekneses Igdoyle. And these sources, L'chayra, would prove that we're dealing with a Dioraisa, and it would substantiate the opinion of the Rambam against the Ramban. And I said three sources, Torah, Nevi'im, V'Ksuvim. Torah. Vayova Yankev, Shchem, Vayichan es Pnei Uir. I think Rashi on the spot brings the Medrash, Vayichan Pnei Uir. It was Erev Shabbos afternoon, and Yankev found a Mukim Chanoye, which was within 2,000 ames, because you cannot go more than 2,000 ames mechutz le'iyah. So Yankov Avinu was makpid and Techumin, and the Medrash says Mekanshi Yankov Shoma Shabbos. So obviously, if Yankov Avinu was makpid and Techumin, it must be a Dioraisa. Sefer Yeshua Perek Gimel. I don't recall the exact version of the posuk, and I don't have an Nevi'im Rishonim here in this room, but on Sefer Yeshua, Yeshua ben Nun says you should find a mukim. It was in the days of Kibush Etz Yisur, when they were waging war, and Yeshua says you should find a mukim for the Oroin and the Machna. Our camp should be within 2,000 ames, in order that in Shabbos they should be able to go to the mukim of the Oroin to daven, to pray. So that's an additional source that Techumin Alpayim Amo is Menatoira. Source number 3 is in Ksuvim, in Megillas Rus. When Naomi tells Rus, and trying to persuade her, go back to your people, go back to your nation, and Rus says, Ba'asher teilchi eilech, and the Gemara in Yevamis, Mem Zayin, the Gemara's interpretation is, Rus tells Naomi, wherever you go, I shall go. What you do, I shall do. And ba'asher telchi I won't go out of Tchum Shabbos. So Yaakov Avinu, Yeshua ben Nun, Rus HaMoyavio, that is many years before Anshe Knesset Gdolah, and they were Makbel and Techumin, but it still doesn't prove that Techumin min HaTorah. Let us not forget Kim Avrom Avinu Kol HaTorah Kula Shelo Nitno, and that's a tradition of Avrom gave over to Yitzchak and Yitzchak to Yaakov. So it should be no wonder that over Yisur Olam, from Yaakov Avinu to Yeshua ben Nun to Rus HaMoyavio, were Mekayim Techumin, even though it would not be a Dioraisa. If Techumin is Dioraisa, is that only a Lois Essa or a Mitzvah Asay as well? So I'm just turning around. I want to take a Rambam. Oh, this is a bit strange. I don't find the Rambam Zmanim behind my back. But the Rambam writes in the very first halacha, Perek Aleph Halacha Aleph Hilchos Shabbos, that we are mitzvah b'shmiras Shabbos, mitzvahs aseh and mitzvahs lo ta'aseh, lo yisaseh halacha on one hand, v'yom shviat tishbos on the other. V'kol ois halacha b'Shabbos over mitzvahs aseh, u'ben lo ta'aseh. So the Minchas Chinuch mitzvah Chov Daled has a chakira. If a person goes chutz l'tchum, is he violating a mitzvah aseh as well, or only a lo ta'aseh? Do we say just as if you would do a malacha, and that would be an esav, a lo yisaseh, would the same apply to tchumin? And the Minchas Chinuch wants to argue that this depends on another machlokes and Rishonim, machamer achar behemtoi b'Shabbos. So let me give you a very brief introduction to the concept of machamer. There are three different levels in the interaction between a man and his animals that are in his possession. Shvisas behemta, which means a Jew is mechuyev not only to refrain from doing a malacha and Shabbos, even as an animal, whether it's a mule or a horse, or an ox, or whatever it is, those animals cannot do a malacha either. And that's a shvisas behemtoi. And even though you're not involved at all, you rented out an animal to a non-Jew, you lent an animal to a non-Jew, you are required to stipulate with that non-Jew, you cannot do a malacha and Shabbos with my animal. That's a mitzvah aseh shvisas behemtoi. On the other end of the spectrum, the Ramban explains in Masechet Shabbos Kuf Nun Gimel that when a person plows his field with an animal, whether it's a horse or an ox, that is as if he is doing the malacha. And the animal is like a tool, like a drill, like a hammer. You're using the animal. It's your malacha. But between the two extremes, there's machamer. Machamer is when you cause the animal to do a malacha, but not physically, but rather just by using your voice. You talk to the animal, you shout at the animal, and the animal starts walking, and he plows the field, or he carries something on his back from one rishus to the other. Machlokes Rishonim, whether it's an aseh or a lo ta'aseh. But in that event, because you're only using your voice, only vocalizing, it would not be considered as if you did the malacha. And there definitely would be no koros misas based on ankor mechatos. And there's a machlokes that is showing the machamer achar behemtoi b'Shabbos. Is he mevatla mitzvah aseh of Shabbosoin or not? Rashba, Yevamis Davav, quotes as Rebbe Rabbeinu Yoina that there is no bitul mitzvah aseh, and the Rashba disagrees, and the Rashba says there is a bitul mitzvah aseh. So comes along the Minchas Chinuch, and the Minchas Chinuch writes that Machamer and Techumin are the same. Why are they the same? What do they have in common? They have one thing in common. Both are alav, and in both cases, it is not considered that the person did a malacha on Shabbos. He's not chayav koros misas basin or korban chatos, and therefore the Minchas Chinuch maintains din zeh ke din zeh. And I argue they have nothing to do one with another. And one could be machalik and differentiate between machaber and Techumin lakan or lakan to both sides. On one hand, even if we say by Techumin there is no bitul mitzvah aseh, Mechamer would be chomru minei. Because in Mechamer, you're dealing with lamatas malachas at the end of the day. It's a malacha. And the mitzvah to say b'yom Tishbeis means lishbot ma'asiyas malacha. Mechamer is a malacha and Techumin is not. On the other hand, one could argue the other way around. Maybe Techumin is yoisechomem mechamer. Because by mechamer the person does nothing. He's just vocalizing. He's just using his voice. Nothing beyond that. But by Techumin, you are the one that violated Shabbos. You are the one that walked chutz l'tchum Shabbos. So maybe even if by mechamer we say there is no Yom Tishbeis, maybe by Techumin there is. I think the question of mechamer is a totally different question. It's a legitimate question. But it has nothing to do with Techumin. And the way I would understand the Shaila, and the Machlokes Rishonim, whether by mechamer there's a bittul mitzvah say is, how do we understand the essence of the Aveira of the Issur of mechamer? Is it an extension of Shvisas Behemtoi with a harsher touch? Because Shvisas Behemtoi there is no involvement, and by mechamer after all, I am crying out to the animal and causing him to do a malacha. But in essence, it's about the behemoth's shvisa, or is it about the person's shvisa? And it is an extension of a siyas malacha, elo shikal minei, because he's not actually physically doing the malacha, but rather just using his voice. Is it about shvisa sa'odam, or is it about shvisa behemtoi? That would be the question, is there a bittul mitzvah say? And this would be dependent on another machlokes rishonim that we find. Is there an issa mechamer only achar behemto, or even behemes acherim, or behemes hefker? And that once again is a machlokes rishonim. Rashbo Shabbos Kuf Nun Gimel clearly says there is an issa mechamer regardless whom the animal belongs to, even a behemes hefker or behemes chavenoi. So according to Rashbo, it's clear. It has nothing to do with Shvisas Behemtoi. Shvisas Behemtoi is only my animal. Mechamer is anyone's. So the Rashba would maintain it's an extension of a siyas malacha. And the Rashba l'shitosoi. And that's why the Rashba also maintains bitul mitzvah sasai. Hagos al she'avoid zora perek aleph sav simachov beis clearly says Mechamer is only achar behemto. So his understanding would be it is an extension of Shvisas Behemtoi. So that is the way I understand the question of mechamer. Rashba l'shito saying two different questions are dependent on the fundamental understanding. What is the Aveira of mechamer? But as I explained before, the way I see it, that has nothing to do with Techumin. I think the question of Techumin is elsewhere. Machlokes, Poskim, and Rishonim. When a person's amal goes chutz l'tchum, is that an Aveira of Shvisas Behemtoi? Mogen Avram Reish Mem Vav Sif Kot Yud Beis says yes. Mogen Avram Shin Hey Sif Kot Yud Ches brings that's a machlokes darka Moshe and Levush. I don't think it's a contradiction. Shin Hey brings the machlokes. He's not machriya. Reish Mem Vav, he voices his opinion. There is an Issur of Shvisas Behemtoi. Hagoyes Mordechai Kedushin Tov Kuf Samachei clearly says Techumin has nothing to do with Shvisas Behemtoi. So I think Shvisas Behemtoi depends on Shvisas Ha'odam. And if the behemoth is not mevatel mitzvah shvisa, if it goes out schut l'chum, I think same would refer to the man. So it would only be a lav of al yetze ishmem koimoi, but not the bitul mitzvahs hashvisa. And this brings us to another question that the Mogen Avram, not the Mogen Avram, the Ashur. Mashok Subas of Zion asks, why don't we find a heter of Oichel Nefesh b'Yamtev by Techumin? If the Torah is matir a malacha for Oichel Nefesh, Kal v'choimer, Techumin is a Issur Kal, why wouldn't it be mutar b'makom Oichel Nefesh? Tshuvas Chasam Sofer Achaim Puf Memtes says, doesn't understand the question because Techumin is not a malacha. And Oichel Nefesh is a clear concept that's associated with Asiyas Malacha. The Torah is matter Asiyas Malacha Melechas Oichel Nefesh. Techumin is not a Malacha, and therefore it's not relevant to Oichel Nefesh. So this once again, L'chor is dependent How do we define the Issur of Techumin? Does it have the nature and the spark of Malachas? And it has similar Gedorim? Or it has nothing to do with Malachas? It's totally an Issur b'fnei atzma. The Marsho felt it is similar to a Malacha. And therefore there should be a heter of Oichel Nefesh. The Chassam Sofer says, what does that have to do with Malacha? So this question might be dependent on the previous one. Is there an Issur Shvisis behemtoi betchumin? Would there be a bittul mitzvah satzeh b'yom shvi tishbois betchumin? And all these three questions depend on what is the nature of Issur Techumin. I just want to mention that the Ramban, Melchames Beitza Daf Yud Gimel, defines Techumin as a malacha. He definitely doesn't mean to say it's a malacha like the Lamates Malachas. Lamates Malachas from 1 to 39 are enumerated in the Mishnah, Shabbos Ayin Gimel. Ovas Malachas Aboam Chosachas. But what we could learn from the Ramban, it has the nature of a malacha, and it is relevant to all the previous questions we asked. So I quoted the Chassam Sofer saying, Oichel Nefesh doesn't apply to Techumin because it's not a malacha. Totally distant Inyan. Chassam Sofer Pashas V'yishlach deals with a famous question. Avraham Avinu was Makayim Kol HaTorah Kula, obviously Shabbos included, but Nochri Sheshuvas Chayav Misa. And there are so many different pilpulim and drushim on this question. The Chassam Sofer Ala Torah says, if you go out chutz l'tchum, you're no longer a Nochri Sheshuvas. And this should be dependent on the very Haggadah. Is that considered a bittul shvisa? If it's not a bittul of shvisa, then he might still be Nochri Sheshuvas. Would that be a contradiction of the Chassam Sofer? Well, it might, but it's not such a big pella. This is Drush al Parshiyas Shavua. That's Shuvas, two different areas. One more question. And this question, once again, depends on the very essential understanding of Techumin. Is there an Issur D'Oraisa, Techumin and Yom Tov? According to the Rambam, that Techumin is the D'Oraisa, Yud Beis Mel, or the Rambam is Sefer HaMitzvos even al Payim Amo. Does it apply to Yom Tov as well? So Toysem Psuchim Daf Hey says, according to the Manda Omar, Havora Lalav Yotzes, the only other Malacha out of the Lamed Tes that has a Posek Mefurish is Alav, is Havora. Lo Yisavaru Eish B'chol Moshe Seichem. And it's a Machloikes Tanoim. Why is Havora an exception? All the other Malachas don't have a Posek. We just learned them from Malachas Mishkan. Havora Lalav Yotzes or Lachatas Yotzes. Toysem Psuchim Daf Hey says, according to the Mandomer Havora Lalav Yotzes, and it's only Alav, no Chorus, no Misbeis, no Chatas, then it doesn't apply to Yom Tov. Because what the Torah asks Yom Tov is Lamates Malachas. Kol Malachas Avodah Lo Ta'asu. But if Avora is only Alav, it's not a Malacha, then the Posek speaks about Shabbos, and not about Yom Tov. Same would apply to Al Yetzish Mem Koimai. This Posek refers to Shabbos and not to Yom Tov. And if it's not a Malacha, how do we know Yom Tov there's an Issur? The Ramban Erev Memalev clearly says, Techumin b'Yom Tov is a Mena Torah. Maybe Ramban L'Shitosoi. I just a few minutes ago mentioned that the Ramban in Masechet Beis defines Techumin as a Malacha. I said it's not one of the Lamates Malachas, but it has the nature of a Malacha, and therefore, Din Yom Tov Kidin Shabbos. It is also clear in the Magen Avraham Siman Tov Kuf Pei Vav. Techumin b'Yom Tov is Mena Torah. Pri Chodesh Tov Tzadikei Elchas Yom Tov says, Techumin b'Yom Tov is only Midrabanan. Agrees Turei Even Chagige Daf Yud Zayin. And this question, once again, would L'chayre be dependent? How do we define the Issur of Techumin? So up to this point, we spoke Lamdes, Shoresh HaSugya, and now I want to move forward in a question which has extreme relevance to Halacha L'Maaseh, even though this sheet is not a platform for Halacha L'Maaseh. I do that all day and all night on many different platforms. But it is always interesting just to enlighten and speak about shaylas that are negei Halacha L'Maaseh. So when a nurse or a doctor or a yeledes or a person not feeling well needs to get to the hospital, and we consider hakala kal tchila, what is the way to get to the hospital with minimizing Chil Shabbos? And sometimes one of the problems would be Techumin. And this is an especially burning problem for many young nurses and even doctors or patients that live in Judea and Samaria, Yehuda v'Shomron, and sometimes there's a lot of open space between their settlement, their town, and the hospital. Might be Alpayim Mama, sometimes it would even be Yud Beis Mil. So in Erev Mem Gimel Amud Aleph, there's a boy in the Gemara, Yesh Techumin Amal HaMasora, Ein Techumin Amal HaMasora. L'Amal HaMasora Tfochem is there an Issur of Techumin. Baye de lo ifshata. And it's a Metov Dalet Sif Aleph and Shulchan Aruch says, it's a suffix, and therefore, B'derabona were Mekel, Sveke Derabona Kula, B'diurais were Machmi, and the Mishnah Brura on the spot explains. Alpayim Mama, according to the Rambam, most Poiskim, the B'Shoysev is only B'derabona. So we would be Mekel B'Techumin Amal HaMasora. You would base Velas Menatera, we would be Machmi. So in that very same Sugah, the Gemara says, if you're walking on Yeseidos, like little stages, little protrusions that protrude, that stick out of the ground, if they're Asor Tvochem, then that would be dependent on the question, Yesh Techumin Amal HaMasor. But if they're Daled al Daled, Yesh Techumin Amal HaMasor Kuli Alma. Why? Rashi explains, Nichat Tashmishtei. And that is why Ara Semichta. It's like Ara Semichta. But if it's less than Daled al Daled, Lo Nichat Tashmishtei, that is the question of Yesh Techumin Amal HaMasora or not. And the very same sugya, we learned that a svina, a boat, a ship, ain't Techumin Amal HaMasora. So why don't we say with a boat or a ship that is Ara Semichta? Various different interpretations of the Rishonim. The Areim, quoted by many Achronim, the opinion of the Areim is only by Yeseidos, which are permanent and not temporary, and they're not mobile. They're in one place. Stick to the ground. It is only then that we say Ara Semichta. But a boat or a ship, which in constant motion, we don't say Ara Semichta. Another interpretation is Ara Semichta is only something that rests on the ground. But a boat is on water, not on the ground. We can't say Ara Semichta. That lachori depends on the different pshotim in Gittin Daf Ches regarding Otzes Bisfina. Does it have a din of Etzesol or not? But I don't want to go into a lengthy discussion on this specific point. So the Shulchan Aruch paskins, it's a suffix whether yes Techumin Amal HaMasora or not. By Yeseidos, it's an Issur, a boat not. How about a train or a wagon? Machlokes Rishonim. Beis Yosef Reish Samach Vav is Machmir. Bekoroin, 200 years ago, trains came before cars. Many years before Henry Ford developed the first Model T, there were already trains. Sam Sofer Tshuvas, Chelek Vav, Siman Tzadik Zayin, Sam Tzadik Resach, Sofer says, a train, Ara Semichta. The seat you're sitting on is Daled al Daled, Nichet Tashmishtei, as a din of Yeseidos. Sam Sofer deals with a train. The Beis Yosef deals with karoin, a wagon pulled by horses or other animals. But their opinion is, even though the train or the wagon is not in one place, we still say Ara Semichta. And it doesn't depend whether it's permanent or temporary, but in different interpretations. But the Beis Yosef also says if you're sitting on the back of an animal, that is the question of Techumin Amal HaMasora v'yesh leho keil. And why is that? Either because the back of an animal not always has Daled al Daled. It depends what animal. If you're sitting on an elephant, that's Daled al Daled. Wouldn't be different than a train or karoin. If you're sitting on a little donkey, usually his back wouldn't be wide Daled al Daled. So these are different questions that came up throughout the ages. L'chore, there are two Gemaras that there's an Issur Techumin even if you're sitting on an animal. One is Beit Zelam Advav Mid Beis. Ein roich v'nal gabe b'heime, the Mishnah says, and the Gemara have different reasonings. Why is it prohibited to sit on an animal, to ride an animal on Shabbos? La'lochu we paskin shem yachtor zemoirem, but there's one mahalach in the Gemara shem yitzchus l'tchum. So many Achronim ask, Gemora Meforeshes, if you leave Tchum Shabbos on an animal, then you're over on the Issur of Techumin. Mogen Avram, Reish Samachov Sif Zayin says, usually you sit on a horse, your feet are below Asarat Tvachim. Once again, it depends how big the animal is. If you're sitting on an elephant, your feet are above Asarat Tvachim. You're sitting on a camel, your feet usually would be above Asarat Tvachim. Camels are very big animals. On a horse, depends how big the horse is. On a mule, you're always Lamata Masoro. But the base mayor argues against the Mogen Avram. Doesn't make sense. Why would we look at the feet? If a person stands and walks on the ground, it is the feet that determine what's a Salat Tefachim. But if he sits, it is where he is seated. If his feet are dangling in the air, why would a Salat Tefachim depend on his feet? Comes along the Even HaOiza, and the Even HaOiza says there's no raya at all. So when the Gemara says, Ein rochvan lagabehem shem yetze chutz latchum, as long as he's sitting on the animal, it's okay. Ki ein tchum alamana masorah. The problem is when you ride an animal and the animal moves fast, not always are you aware. Am I still in the tchum or chutz latchum? And then when he's going to dismount from the animal, he's going to have a problem. Ki hayoytze chutz latchum, ein yeredan adamis. That is the chashash. Gemara number 2 is in Chagigit Tezvav Amud Aleph. And it deals with the complex relationship between Acher and Rameya. So Acher left Yiddishkeit entirely, and that's why his name isn't mentioned only once in Mishnah Alisha Ben Avuram, and he is defined as Acher. Minchas Osha Masechet Tovis is a fascinating discussion about the relationship between Rameya and his Rebbe, Acher, Alisha Ben Avuho, but don't look for it in the stores because it's not available yet. It's not printed yet, but it's on the way. It's in the pipeline. So the Gemara tells the story that Acha is riding a horse on Shabbos and Rameya is walking him. And Acha tells Rameya, stop. We're at the end of Tchum Shabbos. And Rameya turns to Acha and he says, Af ato chazoy b'cha. So some Achronim want to prove from here that even though Acha was riding a horse, Rameya says chazoy b'cha because it's Tchum Shabbos. Once again, maybe the mayor just says, get off the horse, dismount that horse, because there's a tekona, not necessarily because of Tchum Shabbos. Anyway, these are the two Gemaras. Both Gemaras could be rejected. It's not a raya from these Gemaras. But let's just summarize. You say this Dalad al Dalad. Yesh Tchumen Aman Amasora, Puchas Medalad al Dalad is a suffix. A boat depends if yesh or ain't tchumen aman masora. Koroin, train, according to Cham Sofer also. Mishnah Brura agrees with Cham Sofer. Rabbi Yehuda Asad, the same, according to Rabbi Yehuda Asad, like the Cham Sofer, or the Chaim Simen Unches. There's an Issur. Reb Shlomo Kluger, Tuv Tam V'das, Shalosh Tuvas Chelek Aleph Samakuf Tzadik Beis. He feels a train. It's like a boat. Ein tchumen lamala me'asara. So this is a fascinating question. And my eitzah used to be to people that need to come to the hospital on Shabbos. Whether it's a yaledes or a person that's not feeling well, whether it's a doctor or a nurse, and he comes mechutz l'tchum. My eitzah always was, take a telephone book, put it on the seat and sit on the telephone book. Puchas medalad al dalad. Lo nichet tashmishtei. If it's lamala masora, ein tchumen lamala masora. And because it's a boy that ifshita, chutz l'alpai mama, yesh lahakel. So this is somewhat a spark of genius. And why did I say a telephone book? Because it's not hardcover, so it's relatively a bit more comfortable. But it isn't really comfortable. So lo nichet tashmishtai, like you say this, that are puchas dalat fachem, and therefore we say ein tchumen lemalama. So the problem is they no longer print telephone books. Everything is digital today, and if you sit on your smartphone, that wouldn't solve the problem. It needs to be something which is relatively big, and you sit on a book. You could always sit on a book, not on a Sefer Kodesh. But hardcover is far less comfortable than something that is softer. But anyway, I never paskin this l'rabim But I do think that by clear halachic criteria, that would be a good idea, because then it has a din if you say this, and in that case, ain't Techumin Amala Masor. Especially when we're dealing with a Paimam, the Rabbanon, the Shulchan says, Sveike de Rabbanon lekulam. So we discussed a few interesting stories and concepts and Yesodis about the Issur Atzeis Chutz L'Tchum. But this week is B'Shalach, and we always speak about Shiras Hayam. The moment B'nai Yisrael Shir Hayam was one of the heights in the story of Klal Yisrael, of the Jewish people. Rasa Shivcho Alayam Mashal Aroy Yecheskel V'Kol HaNeviim, says the Mechilta, and that is B'Shas Kriyas Yamsuf. And the Medrash says, "But Shosha Omri Yisrael Shir Aliyam, Omer HaKadosh Baruch Hu Miyom Shebarasi Oilami." No one said Shira before. I saved Noach from the Mabel, he didn't say Shira. I salvaged Avram Avinu from Ur Kasdim, and he didn't say Shira. I saved Yitzchak from the Akedah, nor did he. And Yankov, whom I salvaged from Lavan and Esav, neither he did say Shira. Ad Shomri Yisrael Shira Aliyam. The others davened. Avram tikkun Shachas, Yitzchak tikkun Minchi, Yankov tikkun Arvis. The Medrash says, Odom Arishan said Mizman Shilem Shabbos, but they didn't say Shira. And why is Shira so unique? And why is Shira so important that HaKadosh Baruch Hu Kivyochel complains? Why didn't anyone say Shira till Kriyas Yamsef? Neither Odom or Noach or Avram, Yitzchak, Yankov, the Shavotim. Obviously, this is something so essential. Oid Amru Chazal, and this is also in Medrash. So this is a unique interpretation. Nochain kisachom miyaz. Me'az means me'az Yoshe Moshe. That is when it's Yashvo Kishel HaKadosh Baruch Hu Afar Pisha Ma'olamoto. So from the first day of creation till Shiras Hayam, Kadosh Baruch Hu's chair Kiviyachal was shaky. We know nothing about the Kisei HaKavod because we know nothing about Masa Merkava. And Yecheskel's Merkava is the Kisei HaKavod. And that is considered to be one of the greatest secrets in Torah mysticism, Masa Merkava. But we do deal with this question by halachic criteria. So, Chazal say, Afar Pishem Yoramoto Loinis, Koinano Kisser Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Ad She'omri Yisrael Shiryam, and that is Nochen Kisser Chmayayis. Oid Omru Chazal, B'shosh Omri Yisrael Shiryam, Lova HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Cholok Shel Teferes, Shayu Chakukim Bakol Az Shebetera. And what does this mean? So one of the themes I talk about regularly, and you've heard this many times from me, is the importance of Hallel. The Ramban, and I quoted this so many times at the end of Parshas Boy, Tachlis HaYetzir HaRishono, Ve'ein La'el Elyon, Chayfetz V'Tachtoinim, Kiyim Sheyeda Odom V'Yoyder Elokov Shabaroi, Ve'zeh Kavonas Kol HaMitzvahs Kulam. Zeh Kavonas Kol HaMitzvahs Kulam. Ve'zeh Inyen Roimeh Mesakoel B'Tfilo. And whenever I mention the Ramban, I say, Yeshaya Nuvi said this before him in Perek Mem Gimel. Amzu yotzarti li tilosi yisaperu. Like the Radak explains, Amzi yotzarti li kedei shetihilosi yisaperu. So Shira is the highest level of the Vekas, and it is Tachlis Habriya. Amzu yotzarti li tilosi yisaperu. That is why Kodesh Baruch Hu challenges us and puts us into tests and performs miraculous miracles. Lamala Medech HaTeva. Tihilosi Yisaperu. So it should be no wonder that HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, Miyoim Shebarasi Oilami. No one said Shira. Ad She'omi Yisrael Shira Alayam. And because this is Tachlis Sabriya Loines, Koinenu Kisei Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Ad She'omro Yisrael Shiru Alayam. Because Shiru is so important and so essential. In a way, it actually is Tachlis Sabriya. And when the people of Israel reached such amazing heights such a hisalus. In Masechet Sanhedrin, Perek Chelik, the Gemara asked, Az Yushia Moshe seems to be in the future. Az Yushia, not Az Shar. So I think when Bnei Issur reached this unbelievable madrega and level of elevation and closeness to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, they also said Shira ala Osid, Az Yoshia Moshe. So they said Shira ala Wava, Shira Sayam. But they also saw in their mind's eyes and vision the Geula Shleima. V'az Yoshia Moshe Barosh Enoshit. When Mashiach comes once again, we will say Ashira Chadosha Shibchi Geulim L'Shimcho Hagadol. So when Bnei Issur said Shir Ariyam, Lavash HaKadosh Baruch Hu Chaluk Shel Teferes Shayu Chakukim Ba Kol Oz Shebetoira. Oz Yoimru Bagoyim Higdal Hashem L'Asis HaMeileh. Oz Yemoles Choik Pinu Ul Shoineinu Rino. Oz Yeboka Keshachar Orech. V'tzidkoseich kelapid yiv'ar. Yerosen sheniske b'maheru v'yameinu. With Bias Mashiach Tzidkenu once again to say Shiro Chadosho Lefnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. All the best.